All right, I'm going to try to do my best to keep us on time and not have us get started off late. So I'm going to go and get things started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Beck. I'm the interim director of the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, which for the rest of the conference we'll be referring to as UMMAA. It's a bit of a mouthful to try to get out every other sentence. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the beginning of our centennial event, UMMAA at 100, Michigan's Mark, Past, Present, and Future. In 1922, Carl Gutta, a newly minted PhD in anthropology from Harvard, but with a BA from Michigan, saw part one of his vision for anthropology at UM realized with the founding of what was then the Museum of Anthropology. Part two, the Department of Anthropology, would follow 6 years later. From the beginning, Gutta saw his aim of this museum not as a cabinet of curiosities, as a collection of antiquities, but as a research museum that would contribute to anthropological knowledge through both carefully documented collections and curators who engaged in active field and laboratory work. In time, the museum developed world-class research collections with particular strengths in North America, the Great Lakes, and Asia, Gutta's own area of research. About 1937, another newly minted PhD, this one from James B. Griffin, would join the ranks of museum curators, and when Gutta departed for the New York State Museum in 1944, Griffin would take over as UMMAA's next director, a role he held for 3 decades. In those years, Jimmy Griffin steered the museum through the radiocarbon revolution and helped to develop the culture history paradigm. But then, in the late 1960s, when he saw that change was coming to the field of American archaeology, he did something as remarkable as it was unexpected. He went out and hired a bunch of young hotshots, the new archaeologists who would turn the field of archaeology on its head. Bob Whalen, Henry Wright, both of whom are with us here today, and Kent Flannery came first, then Jeff Parsons, Loring Brace, and Dick Ford. John Speth and Joyce Marcus followed soon after, and the University of Michigan became the best place in the world for the study and practice of anthropological archaeology. Now another half-century has passed. The field of archaeology is more diverse, both in terms of its practitioners and the theories that guide their practice, than at any time in its history. Just as importantly, the field is recognizing a broader and more diverse array of stakeholders in the sites we study and the collections we curate, demanding a more just and collaborative pursuit of archaeological knowledge. And so it is with UMMAA. We have new curators with new interests, though many of these are rooted in the same themes and theories developed by those hotshot new archaeologists a half-century ago. We have new methods for exploring the human past, and we, with our students, are recommitting ourselves to engagement, collaboration, and partnership with the communities where we work and live. Oh, the students. So many amazing students. More than 250 PhDs in anthropological archaeology and counting, and more archaeology faculty and academic positions than any other program in the United States by a significant margin, and also counting. And for the record, I'm one of the many fine applicants who didn't make the cut, so I'm not bragging about myself. But be that as it may, I'm going to ask all of our alums who are here with us tonight to stand up for a round of applause. You are the museum's greatest legacy. For the next few days, we want to celebrate UMMAA's role in the history of American archaeology and to explore its role in archaeology's present and future as well. But we also want to take this opportunity to think about what we might do differently. Not to curse the candle, as a wise old-timer with a golden Marshalltown once said, but to learn how we can better share its light. We have an incredible series of panels, sessions, and speakers lined up, and we're ready to get started. But before we do, I'd like to acknowledge a few of our supporters and the people who have made this UMMAA at 100 conference possible. UMMAA gratefully acknowledges generous support for this conference from the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, hereafter known as LSA, from the University of Michigan Office of Research, RCI Block Grant from LSA Social Sciences, and from the Department of Anthropology. Thank you to all. We'd also like to acknowledge support for the conference provided by a gift from our late colleague, Dr. Sarah M. Nelson, who passed away in 2020. Dr. Nelson was a graduate of our PhD program in 1973 and served as professor of anthropology for many years at the University of Denver, retiring as Distinguished Professor Emerita for her lifelong research in East Asia. She also served on our Directors Advisory Board here at UMMA. We would not be gathered for this event without the generosity of Sarah and her husband, Dr. Harold Nelson. We only wish that Sarah was here to enjoy the celebration with us. I'd also like to thank our remarkable UMMA staff. They usually work behind the scenes while we take center stage, but let's give them their due right now. Our administrative assistant, Amy Winchester, has many superpowers, but none perhaps more daunting than her powers of logistics and organization. We could have done all of this without Amy, but we'd be putting it on in 21-22 rather than 2022. When we lost Amy to a knee injury a few weeks ago, the rest of our staff, led by Chief Administrator Amy Runquist, the other Super Amy, more than rose to the occasion. Tremendous thank yous to Amy Runquist, Elizabeth Knoll, our publications editor, Bruce Warden, our illustrator, who you'll see taking pictures during the conference, and Julie Winningham, who came over from the Department of Anthropology to help over the past couple of weeks. I'd also like to acknowledge our collections managers, Jim Moss and Andrea Blazer. Jim and Andrea will be giving tours at the Research Museum Center this week. Their work at RMC has taken the UMMA collections from the 1920s to the 2020s in what seems like the blink of an eye, and which you can see for yourself when you visit RMC. I'd like to have all of our UMMA staff stand, and let's give them all a round of applause. You'll stand in for all of them. And I hope, Amy Winchester, that you are not standing, that you are sitting, but this is all for you too. Let me thank our special guests, LSA Dean Ann Curzan, LSA Associate Dean Barb Meek, and Department of Anthropology Chair Kelly Askew, each of whom has generally offered to say a few words here before the evening's panel begins. I'd like to acknowledge our friends with the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance, or MACPRA, and with the Reconnect, Recollect, Reparative Connections to Philippine Collections Project. I'd like to acknowledge our NAGPRA project manager, Dr. Ben Segunda, and our NAGPRA collection manager, Amadeus Scott, for all of their hard work on behalf of the university and tribal stakeholders in the process of repatriation. A devoted group of graduate students, organized by our own Hannah Hoover, have helped with all of the setup and will be working hard throughout the events that we've lined up over the next few days. Please take the opportunity to explore their poster session and ask lots of questions about their fantastic research. Let's have all of our current students stand up as well. And thanks to all of you. We extend a grateful thank you to Julia Falkovich-Kahn for designing the conference website and to the Rackham Graduate School event staff for their help in organizing the conference. I'd like to thank the Directors Advisory Committee and the UMMA Executive Committee for thoughtful advice and encouragement throughout our conference planning. I'd also like to thank Charles Watkinson, Director of the University of Michigan Press, who has helped us to revitalize our own UMMA Press over the last few years. The planning committee for the UMMA at 100 conference is Director Michael Galati, Tiffany Fryer, Raven Garvey, Hannah Hoover, the archaeology grad rep, Brian Stewart, Alicia Frantresca Miller, and me. We have a wonderful relationship with our sister museums here on campus, the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology and the 3 museums with which we share RMC, the Museum of Paleontology, the Museum of Zoology, and the University of Michigan Herbarium. We look forward to continued opportunities for partnership and collaboration. Finally, let me thank our incredible participants, many of whom have come a long way at a challenging time of the year to share their work and thoughts and ideas with us. And let me thank all of you who are taking part as our audience, whether here in person or live streaming wherever you may be. Finally, the University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Wyandot, Seneca, Delaware, Shawnees, Miami, Sauk and Fox, and others. In 1817, the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe nations made the largest single gift to the early university when they granted land through Article 16 of the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land, sovereignty, and their contributions to the university are recognized and reaffirmed. As a museum, we will work to hold the University of Michigan more accountable in sustaining mutually beneficial partnerships with Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations that recognize and fulfill their rights and aspirations. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ann Curzan, and is Dean of our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. I just belayed myself, LSA. She's the Geneva Smitherman Collegiate Professor of English Language and Literature, Linguistics and Education, and she's also the Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of English, Linguistics and Education. We're thrilled to have her help us launch the conference this evening. Ann.
Thank you, Rob, and I'm delighted to be here to get to welcome all of you to this wonderful conference. So as Rob said, I know many of you have traveled far to be here, and we are grateful that you've come to join us. And then some of you just stood who are our alums. And for our alums, welcome home. We're glad you're here. Some of you are current curators and students and staff of the museum, faculty at the museum. I want to thank all of you for your hard work in making this conference happen. It speaks to your dedication to the museum and your dedication to this university. So I also just want to thank all of the speakers and participants who are here for being here. It's really lovely to be able to host this in person. I take nothing for granted about being in person right now, and I see heads nodding that it's wonderful to get to celebrate 100 years of the museum together in person. And at the same time, I'm really glad that for those of you who are live streaming right now, that you've also been able to join us. It's one of the many things we've learned about how to be more accessible to more people, and that people around the world can be sharing this moment with us. So the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology was founded in 1922, hence the 100 years. And so tonight and over the next few days, we get to celebrate the accomplishments of the curators, the students, the staff over the course of those 100 years and look ahead to the next 100 years. So as the dean, and one of the real joys of being dean is that you get to know parts of the college that you don't get to know when you're living in the English department, which is what I spent many years doing. And so really been wonderful to get to know the museum better. As you heard from Rob, it's one of 4 research museums here in the college, and all of which are now housed at the Research Museum Center, or what we call the RMC. So I do hope that many of you who are new to campus will go visit the RMC. I made my first visit there. Again, the joys of being the dean, you get invited to go see the RMC, which I had always heard about and never visited. So it was about a year ago that I made my first visit there, and I was blown away, particularly knowing that I was seeing 0.00001% of what is in RMC. So it holds 3.5 million artifacts from 150 countries. Some are, as it was described to me, mundane, the detritus of thousands of years of human life, from which archaeologists glean information about our species' origins and development. Many of these items, though, bear direct witness to the wonder, resilience, diversity, and sometimes pain of people in the distant and more recent past. So, for example, I saw a bark cloth dress made in Hawaii in the 19th century in emulation of Western styles. And you have to wonder under what conditions that dress was made. Was it out of a kind of appreciation of new fashions, or was it made under duress? I saw objects excavated from caves across the Philippines, acquired during a period of American occupation. Now, under the guidance of Filipino and Filipina scholars here at Michigan, through what we're calling the Reconnect, Recollect Collaboratory, the museum and the university at large are working to decolonize its Philippine collections and to make them available to the wider Filipino-Filipina community. I saw some of these exquisite baskets woven by Anishinaabeg artists, some of which were made by the ancestors of our Native American students and alumni. I know that the museum and our NAGPRA compliance staff are deeply committed to working with Native American partners from tribes across Michigan and the nation to return human remains to bring ancestors home to rest. To close, I wanted to quote from the museum's new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. It's called UMMAA Evolving. And this vision of the museum and for archaeology, and the vision for the museum and for archaeology in terms of where it's moving, it's an ambitious goal. I find it a quite compelling one, and I think it's fitting that we open this conference with these words in mind. And so here I will read from their website. We are a community of faculty, staff, and students committed to creating a cultural and academic space in our museum and university that allows people to participate and contribute with the full expression of their identities and abilities. We recognize that many of these identities have historically been marginalized and systematically excluded from participating and engaging in anthropology, archaeology, and museums. Within these fields, the goal is to understand and relate to the human condition in all its expressions, but as scholars and humans, we have fallen short of this ideal in everyday practice. Researchers in all three disciplines have often viewed individuals and even whole societies as the quote-unquote other, subjects of curiosity to be studied and classified. We reject this view, and we celebrate the full spectrum of identities, including race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, and ability. Further, we recognize that inequities in these fields continue to this day, and that it is our responsibility to deconstruct the systems that allow injustice to persist. You can see why I wanted to read that as a place to start the conference. So thank you, all of you again, for being here. Thank you to everyone who organized this wonderful conference. I am sorry that I cannot stay. That is also part of being the dean, is that I run from place to place. But congratulations. I hope you have a wonderful celebration, and I will say, here's to the next 100 years. So thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Ann. She slipped out the door. She actually literally has a plane ticket. She's sitting straight from here to the airport. So it was really nice of her to come and do that for us before slipping to the airport. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Barbara Meek. Barbara's professor of anthropology and linguistics in the Department of Anthropology and is Associate Dean of Social Sciences as of this semester, starting this semester, in LS&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all for inviting me to, I think this is my first official, ceremonial act as an associate dean, so it's a little, I'm learning the genre still. Hamarawe, hello, good evening. As Rob said, I'm Barbara Meek. What he didn't say, I'm also the former director of Native American Studies, which is where I plan to still be until I was asked by Dean Curzan to join her in the dean's office. And I'm also an enrolled member of the Comanche Nation. So my piece kind of builds on what Ann was saying, sort of how the museum is kind of breaking down some of these old colonialist structures, right? Helping us imagine a way forward into a new and exciting future. And it's a bit of a reflection. So I've been here for, 21 some years now. And when I arrived at Michigan at the turn of the century, UMMAA was in a very different place than it is now, both literally and figuratively. Legislation had been passed in 1990 regulating the return of human remains and funerary objects to U.S. tribes. As you all know, right, it's called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. But the interpretation, right, and the enactment of the legislation initially created more problems than it solved. At U of M, there was no NAGPRA office at the time, no U of M level policies and procedures pertaining to NAGPRA, and no institutional advisory committee. The inventorying of the museum's collections, right, in order to identify ancestors and sacred objects that fell under NAGPRA jurisdiction, fell more or less to a single museum curator and faculty member, Dr. John O'Shea. This was no small task, given the size of the museum's North American and Great Lakes collections. In addition to identifying which matter mattered, there was the step of figuring out cultural affiliation and then contacting the relevant tribes and so on and so forth, right? A monumental task for an organization, let alone a single person. So, and also, right, at this time, as the museum struggled to be in compliance with shifting NAGPRA regulations, right, so they changed over time, tribes started to become more aware of and invested in the process of repatriation or rematriation, creating their own museums, adding or expanding governance structures to help manage the process of repatriation or rematriation, creating things like tribal historic preservation offices and officers, or TIPOs, and tribal research review boards were created, so their own IRBs, and then, right, coordinating their repatriation and rematriation efforts with other tribes. In the state of Michigan, an excellent example, which has already been mentioned, right, of such coordination and cooperation is MAGPRA, the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance. So, right, challenging. So in response to this, U of M and UMMAA established an advisory committee that developed a set of policies and procedures in 2011 to help facilitate the return of ancestors and cultural objects, funerary or otherwise. And now I'm going to quote from the website. As the website states, quote, "The University of Michigan and UMMAA is committed to meeting both the letter and the spirit of the law," right? Not just the letter. So one of the first repatriations following these new guidelines and committee was in fact more in the spirit rather than the letter of NAGPRA, returning ancestral remains and objects to the Whitefish River First Nation in Canada, under the leadership then of Chief Franklin Pabomsai, or Shining Turtle. Since then, the museum has been setting the standard for repatriation worldwide. Based on current information, the university's Native American collections include ancestors and artifacts from 38 states, with approximately 80% of the ancestral remains and 50% of the objects coming from sites in Michigan. The university's NAGPRA Advisory Committee, which I now sit on, has set their return as the first priority. And according to the museum website, approximately 50% have been returned, in no small part due to the efforts now of Ben Secunda, who's been mentioned, the project manager, and Amadeus Scott, who is the collections manager for NAGPRA. In addition, right, to the transformative NAGPRA work that the museum has accomplished, including repairing relationships with state tribes, which U of M is forever grateful, I would say, right? We have been able to now build on this and are trying to think of new collaborations with states, including trying to figure out ways to attract, encourage, support more Native students to come to U of M. So the museum, in partnership with Matei Botanical Gardens, has been working on a Heritage Seeds project that involves MAGPRA and other organizations. And the museum has also supported course initiatives such as Dr. Lisa Young's Museum Studies class that hosted guest speakers Josh and Sarah Hominga, who are award-winning Anishinaabe basket makers and teachers, and who taught me how to make my first strawberry basket, if you've ever done one. And I have no talent in arts and crafts, so it was amazing that I was able to actually finish one, which I owe all to them. And we've also had co-curated exhibits, right? Such as, I'm not reading the Anishinaabe. I don't speak that language. I speak Kaska, and a little Comanche. So it's called They Work With Each Other exhibit. And this one involved the Zibuing Tribal Museum, which is the Saginaw Chippewa Tribes Museum, and UMMAA. So all fantastic initiatives that the museum has been involved in. So to wrap up, now that I'm losing my voice, while there's still much work to do, as always, the museum is clearly on a path toward creating a sustainable and mutually beneficial partnership with Indigenous communities and nations within the U.S. and beyond. And thank you for all that you've done so far and all that you will continue to do. So.
Thank you for that, Barb. Finally, let me introduce Dr. Kelly Askew. who is chair of the Department of Anthropology and the Niara Sudarkasa Collegiate Professor of Anthropology and Afro-American and African Studies.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for being here. Today we officially launch our celebration of the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, UMMAA, founded, as we've heard already, a century ago in 1922. On behalf of the Department of Anthropology, 6 years behind UMMAA, I congratulate all affiliated with UMMAA on this phenomenal achievement. UMMAA, as we all know, is internationally renowned for research on humanity's past. Its collections, as we've just heard, of over 3 million archaeological and ethnographic artifacts teach us otherwise inaccessible knowledge about how people lived in other times and other places across the globe, what they valued, what rituals they practiced, what arts they created, what livelihoods they pursued, and so much more. UMMAA is also a leader, as we just heard also. This is the problem of being third in line, like other things get taken, right? UMMAA is also a leader in reimagining a more inclusive way of pursuing archaeology that includes more diverse voices and perspectives, more attention to equity, inequity, and justice, and a commitment to engaging the communities where archaeologists work in their work. This paradigm-shifting effort is one featured on the UMMAA Evolving page of the website, which I encourage you all to check out. The Department of Anthropology is a steadfast partner to UMMAA in these efforts, and we have worked together to hire several new and talented archaeologists that I'd like to acknowledge. Alicia Ventresca Miller, Tiffany Fryer, Brian Miller, and Julia Saltini Samarari. We're extremely excited to have such a wealth of new energy infuse our units. So with that, I'll keep this short. I'll turn over the microphone and thank you all for joining us today. And thank you once again, all members of UMMAA, for giving us such a joyous reason to gather. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kelly. Let's get down to what we're here for, talking about archaeology, listening to archaeology, thinking about archaeology. I'm going to turn the mic over now to our own director, Mike Galati, who is back from Kosovo for a few days to be with us just for the conference. He's actually on sabbatical for the year, so he's come all the way back across the ocean to take over the director's seat tonight. Mike, off we go.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight on a Friday night. We're going to have our panelists join us up on the stage and get started with our discussion. So I have a few remarks to make before we get going with the discussion. I'll say right off the bat, just like Rob, I applied to Michigan and didn't get in, but you know, hey, so you guys can be really proud of yourselves. Yeah. So, Rob, thanks for everything you've done for the museum, and thanks for stepping in as acting director and the organizational work you've done to get this conference off the ground. So I really appreciate it. And all the staff, graduate students who have helped out, thank you. Thanks, Dean Curzan, wherever you are. Hopefully you're going to get lots of money tonight, wherever you're ending up. Barb Meek, thank you. Appreciate the words. And Kelly Askew, thank you very, very much for your warm welcomes. It's great to be here together to begin this 4-day celebration of the centennial of the founding of the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology here at the University of Michigan. The history of the museum is a long and complex one. It's too long and complex to relate here. We heard a little bit about it from Rob. Founded 1922. Over the course of 100 years, the museum's program of collection and curation, research, teaching, and publication, and its impact in our field of anthropological archaeology has experienced steady, impressive growth. As you've heard, 3.5 million artifacts from 150 countries, a beautiful new curation facility with excellent professional staff, seminal research projects of survey and excavation, backed by literally millions of dollars of grant money, run by giants in the field, Plenary, Ford, Griffin, Marcus, Parsons, Sinopoli, Speth, Whalen, it's out there somewhere, and of course the indomitable Henry Wright. And there are many others. I could go on and on. The PhD alumni employed across the country and world, and a current cohort of what I would argue are absolutely the best graduate students on the planet. Hundreds of books published over the course of 90 years. Indeed, our museum has thrived. But as we've heard, we must also acknowledge, as Dr. Beck did, our colonial roots, firmly sunk in the soil of the Philippines, and our difficult relationship with Native Americans, in particular here in Michigan. It's not enough just to say we are sorry for any suffering we have caused. Rather, we aim to do better in the future. So tonight and over the course of the next several days, we will assess the museum's record and accomplishments, and we'll grapple with our past. But we're also going to look to the future, not only of the museum, but also of the field of archaeology generally. What will that future look like, and what role will Michigan play in molding it? Given our goals for this conference, the Planning Committee decided to begin with a plenary panel discussion. We invited 6 distinguished scholars to help us consider the past and future of the museum and of archaeology. So I'm going to introduce them all. Maybe we can hold applause until I'm done. First, Michael Blakey. Michael is the National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, and Director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. David Hurst Thomas, Senior Curator in Residence in the Division of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History. Patricia McEnany, Keenan Eminent Professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Jeremy Sabloff, Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Anthropology Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, and External Faculty Fellow and past President of the Santa Fe Institute. And Henry Wright, Curator of Near Eastern Archaeology, Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, and Albert Clanton Spalding Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Michigan. And last, but certainly not least, Allison Wiley, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of the Social and Historical Sciences at the University of British Columbia. Each of these individuals has, through their research, in different ways, shaped not just how we study the human past, but why. Tonight, I'll ask a series of questions and moderate an hour-long discussion about the current state of archaeology. We'll reserve a half hour at the end for questions from the audience. It seems to me that we are at a disciplinary crossroads, both in terms of theory building, but also in terms of what our goals for archaeology should be. So I hope tonight we can begin to address these issues, both now and tonight, but then also over the course of the next few days. So let's jump right in here. We're going to get started with Henry Wright. I have a question for Henry Wright. Henry, Michigan archaeology is known for its generalizing, comparative approach to past human behavior. But that approach has been questioned both in the past and now. So Henry, is there a future for Michigan's brand of archaeology? You can turn your mic on.
How's that? Thanks. Shall I get up there or shall I stay here?
You can stay there.
Thank you. I wonder why I was chosen for this task, and I decided it's because I'm the oldest person in the Museum of Anthropology. I've been here since I arrived as a freshman in 1960, and walk into the old Museum of Anthropology to see Jimmy Griffin, who immediately assigned me to work for 25 cents an hour washing fire-cracked rocks. This is a test to see if you're really serious about archaeology. Griffin had spent most of his career establishing the cultural sequence of the ancient peoples of Eastern North America. He published extensively in this area, and he's remembered mostly for the creation of this cultural chronology and of dating it with the then newly invented radiocarbon method. He presented us with a terrible problem. What our predecessors in North American archaeology thought was a relatively short period of time was in fact a very long period of time. We knew at that point in 1960 it was more than 10,000 years. We now think it's closer to 20,000. So we're dealing with an extensive and complicated cultural record, very different in different areas of the New World. Griffin, however, felt he had solved these problems. He didn't have to worry about chronology anymore, and he was going to do something different. And what he wanted to do was what he called ecology. And that was to understand these ancient cultures in their natural contexts. And to do this, he tapped one really strong resource of the museum that was already developed towards this end, which was archaeobotany or paleoethnobotany, through the work of the wonderful Volney Jones. And Volney had trained a very fine student, Richard Yarnell, who spent the rest of his career in North Carolina developing a program in paleoethnobotany, archaeobotany. And he was not just interested in what traditional modern Native American gardeners did and Native American food collectors did. He was interested in finding actual archaeological evidence of this. So he's the founder of archaeobotany in North America. He trained, Jones trained Yarnell. Yarnell trained a variety of people. Jones also trained Richard Ford. Richard Ford came back here and became a leading figure in this area. Griffin also added an archaeozoologist, a graduate student, Charles Cleland. Many years was a leading figure and chair at Michigan State University. We do have good cooperation with Michigan State University. Are you able to hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. But Griffin's ideas of ecology were not particularly sensible. It was just another trait for him and trait list. And he was bound and determined to not get too involved with this stuff called anthropology. Now, we arrived believing that archaeology was anthropology or it was nothing, which is a little extreme, but it's a good tonic. And he had graduate students who were here when I showed up in short pants, washing fire-cracked rocks, who were interested in revolutionizing archaeology, and they were heavily influenced by our cultural anthropologists. And in particular, they were interested in something called the comparative method. And Mike has mentioned the comparative method and asked me if it's still relevant. It's a method. It's not a theory. It's used to great effect by paleontologists, biologists, historians. It involves two possible very different approaches, which you must keep in mind. On the one hand, comparativists study differences that arise in the context of similarity, that from a common ancestor culture or a common ancestor biological clade, there's a radiation or a spreading of the descendants into different kinds of situations, and those situations are thought to determine or thought to underlie the differences that arise. And we had a cultural anthropologist that practiced this with a passion in his early mistaken youth named Marshall Solins. Marshall Solins, as for his dissertation at Columbia, took the related cultures of Polynesia and looked at how different Polynesian peoples who came from a kind of protoculture, which we now know archaeologically as a Lapita culture, and how as they went to different kinds of islands, large islands, small islands, rich islands, low islands, they developed very different kinds of social and cultural organization. But there's another thing you can do. You can look at the rise of similarities in a context of difference, the reverse. You can look at the development of some kind of cultural organization or cultural feature in different places independently that are not in any way related. This method has a long history in anthropology. Fraser used this in the Golden Bough. Egan used it in the Western Pueblos. And I could go on ad nauseum about different uses of the comparative method, but Mike, I won't do it. The application of similarities in the context of differences was in fact brought into archaeology by a streperous graduate student named Louis R. Binford. His dissertation, which has never been published, but which is available, is a situation in which he had the rise of what Solons and Binford called chiefdoms in the area of today North Carolina and Virginia. And they were from different language families. They were from quite different cultural origins. They spoke Algonquin languages, Siouan languages, Iroquoian languages, languages that diverged from their common early Siberian ancestors more than 12 or 13,000 years ago. And yet they had derived or developed similar kinds of cultural systems. And Binford proposed to explain this in terms of the ecology of the tributary rivers of the Chesapeake Bay, the differing ecology and the similarities in that ecology. So it was something that we were interested in as archaeologists, even though it had been done by many cultural anthropologists and historians and biologists before archaeologists found it. It's still being done, and I will now leap over 50 years. There is a wonderful series of papers comparing the diversification of Polynesians and diversification of African people speaking related Bantu languages, showing we have, from these two very different parts of the world, the development of very similar things in which there are radiations in both the Polynesian area, the radiation of Austronesian, and the Bantu-speaking area in Africa, that the comparative method, both aspects of the comparative method can be used to explain things. We're very fortunate to have Marcus Hamilton here today, who wrote one of these papers and led the research team at Santa Fe Institute that did the simultaneous comparison of the Austronesian peoples and the Bantu peoples. Now, these are not without problems. They have not solved all the problems of cultural diversification. For one thing, they actually accepted the statements that anthropologists and historians had made about these various Austronesian and Bantu cultures, and I could argue with Marcus over many a beer about just exactly how these societies were organized and how it should be coded, how the initial work should be done. But the team deserves, these two teams, several teams deserve great credit for continuing to use the comparative method in a statistically much more rigorous manner than I did.
So Henry, let me jump in there. So your short answer is yes. Yes.
No, that's just the comparative method. I have a section on ecology and evolution.
Does anyone else want to jump in here and say what they think? We know what Henry thinks. What do you all think? Comparative method, the Michigan approach to archaeology?
It's not a method.
It's not a method.
It's not an approach of Michigan. I'm trying to deny your point.
He's denying my point. Point taken, Henry.
Shall I go on?
Tricia?
Yeah, I would just like to follow up on something that Henry started talking about, and that is when you mentioned that a more recent analysis had been done that was much more sophisticated than what you had originally attempted. And I think that processualism tried to shift the goalposts away from, classification, which was the goal of culture history, and towards a more sort of nuanced understanding of process. But they really kept those old classificatory frameworks. And I think that was a real mistake. And I think that now we're at a place where we have just a whole range of methods that can be utilized, that we don't need to lean on that so much anymore. And we can move away from it, and we can do comparisons that are based on this sort of kind of, interesting conceptual frameworks rather than, band tribes, chiefdoms, or something like that. And so I think that it's, it's probably moving back, maybe coming full circle in a way, and coming back to a kind of comparison that has shed all that baggage that processualism pulled along with it. Mike?
That's why I was so cautious about the use of the term chiefdom. That's a term that had a lot of meaning for them. It has different meanings for us now. And in fact, a wonderful dissertation done years ago with some of our students at Hunter College on African systems proposed a completely different structure of classificatory terms. And you change classifications to clarify the questions you're asking. And some classifications are probably leading you to disaster. Tribe is a famous one, and I think we all recognize that one is almost useless. But there are certain taxa that we get from ancient scholars, and many cultural traditions have an idea of what is a state. We live in states today. They are killing us. They're killing Ukrainians right now. And this is a problem system. And when we work on the beginnings of the first states, which is what I do mostly, and I'm not going to talk about it, we'll talk about it over beers. I'm talking about something that's not an ancient problem, but a problem right now. So I quite agree. Thank you for your comment.
Anyone else? So my next question is a good follow-up, I think. It's actually for Allison. Allison, you've recently written quite a bit about the philosophical importance of perspective, that one's position in the world, their standpoint, influences the conclusions one draws. Is this true of archaeology? And if so, what does that mean for a generalizing comparative archaeology, the way Henry just very nicely described it?
The short answer is yes. Definitely. And it's a two-part question, so I've been thinking about two-part answer. In fact, it was you archaeologists who made me do it, right? And got me to think systematically about this values in science, philosophical philosophy of science literature, and feminist standpoint theory. And so I'm going to just describe some old work that I think illustrates or could be the basis for an answer to the first part of your question. It was the emergence of gender, the gender research program, or research on women and gender as it was described, in archaeology in the late 80s and 90s that brought home to me, made me aware of the relevance and significance of this values in science literature and standpoint theory. And pivotal for me were two events. One was the Wedge Conference that Joan Jarrow and Meg Conkey organized in '88, I think it was, published in Engendering Archaeology in '92. And the other, the Chakmool 1989 Archaeology of Gender Conference. I start with the latter. It was the first Anglophone open call for papers on questions about gender. And it drew over 100 contributions, 80% of them by, and so everyone was talking at the time in terms of binary gender, 80% of them by women. I was curious about what drew all these women to the conference, because this was a much bigger conference than Chakmool had ever seen before, like twice as large. And people came from all over. It was a very international conference. It was quite different in scale and composition than previous CHACMOLs. So I was curious about, well, in composition also, 80% women, more than inverted the representation of women in the field at the time. I was curious what drew them to the conference. I did a survey about a year and a half later, got about 3/4 of people responding, which was pretty amazing. The survey people I went to talk to said, there is no way you're going to get more than like 5 answers, because they were all open-ended, qualitative. Tell me all about what, you know. Anyway, 75%. People were really motivated. A majority, one of the things I learned was that a majority of the women who attended the conference had never been to a CHACMOL conference before. A majority of the men were, the senior men went regularly. They went every year, no matter what the theme or topic. The women, in terms of demographics, were clustered in a middle kind of age range, late 20s through 40s. So they'd more or less finished their academic training, their professional training, and they were setting out on professional careers, getting established in professional positions in archaeology. The age distribution for men was very strikingly bimodal. Young graduate students, very early career, and a bunch of senior old dogs. The old dogs were the ones who came always to CHACMOL. So I assumed that what attracted this international cohort, primarily the women, to CHACMOL was a pre-existing engagement with what was described at the time as women's studies, possibly feminist activism. I thought that they would have been already involved politically in one way or another, and they were drawn to this conference as like the first major opportunity where they could put together their activist and feminist scholarly interests with their archaeological interests. What I learned was that despite majority of them indicated they had what they described as a prior interest in questions about gender and women, and that was true for the men who attended as well as the women, or who were giving presentations. But they also made it clear that this was a new area of research for them. And a majority had no activist, no women's studies, scholarly engagement in the past. Some were quite vehement that they were definitely not feminists, and they weren't there because this was a feminist conference. So there was this real dissociation from the F word at the time. Now, and interestingly, at the McConkey Joan Gerald conference, at the Wedge conference, I was really struck that the organizers self-identified as feminists. They were there for a purpose. They had a feminist agenda. But most of the people who Meg and Joan had invited said, well, sure, I was keen to go spend like a couple of days with my friends and hang out and talk about this stuff. But I didn't think the question to them was, look at your database, look at work in your area, and consider what questions could you ask? What could you learn about gender, women, gender roles, divisions of labor in the research areas where you work? And most of them started their presentations, discussion of these pre-circulated papers, by saying, I thought there was nothing to be said about this. Like, if there was anything to be said, business as usual, archaeology as usual, good systematic empirical work would have turned it up. And every one of them said they were blown away by what they came up with when they asked those questions, when they shifted the frame and asked those questions. This is probably familiar to all of you, as I see some people, yeah, okay, I'm boring you with the reprise of many years ago. Anyway, archaeologist Jane Kelly and her writing partner, philosopher Marcia Hannon, had done an analysis of the abstracts for the CHACMOL conference. And they commented on the fact that there were no references to any feminist literature or any of the women's studies literature that might be relevant for doing this work. And they described this as they described what we were seeing with this massive response to the CHACMOL call for papers as an untheorized, apolitical, grassroots interest in questions about gender relations and institutions and roles. I thought of it as a standpoint. I was using the language of standpoint at the time in a way I wouldn't now, but as a standpoint of sensitivity to gender issues. But for many of these early attendees, it was quite explicitly not a feminist standpoint on archaeological practice. So I want to draw that distinction between perspectivalism, situated identity, and standpoint. I'll come back to that in a second. My hypothesis at the time was that demographic shifts in the discipline had disrupted disciplinary norms and roles, gendered roles. Before 1973, for the AAA, or the AIA and the SAA, there hadn't been more than about 18% women on the rolls of those associations. By 1976, they were showing 30%. In an analysis that Tom Patterson did by 1988, so the year before this CHACMOL meeting, there were something like 36% women in the SAA. So a very rapid change in who was doing archaeology, an entrance of a lot of women into the field. So at the same time as I was puzzling about this transformative shift in archaeology, there was kind of roiling debate in feminist science studies, feminist philosophy of science literature about standpoint theory, generated by a realization. I mean, nobody but me was thinking about archaeology, but there was a realization across the board that you saw this transformative criticism, transformative generation of new lines of inquiry in the social sciences, humanities, life sciences, medicine, a range of areas that arose when women and other minoritized people entered these fields in critical mass. Critical race analysis, class analysis, feminist analysis arose with shifts in the demography of these fields. And they were asking, these people coming in were asking these probing questions, identifying gaps and distortions and biases that hadn't been noted, and opening up whole new areas of research, given that critical insight. So the question for the feminist science studies and critical race theorist, standpoint theorists, was like, what makes the difference here? Is it just situated experience, that people are coming into the field with differently situated experience? In the case of women in archaeology, aware, probably at some level, of disrupting gender norms about who does archaeology, and meeting certain kinds of resistance and so on, makes you reflective about how plastic or not sex gender roles are? Or is there something more going on here? And something more would be a critical standpoint on knowledge production, which is a distinct thing, not absolutely separate from, but a distinct stance from just a situated, experientially based perspective. And the other question was, does this realization open the door to crazy, make it up how you want it relativism? I mean, the world we now live in of alternate everything, facts, truths, whatever. Thinking about gender archaeology, I made this argument that standpoint, as I've just said, should be considered distinct from situated knowledge. It's a claim about contingent epistemic advantage on the margins, not automatic or categorical privilege. That's what gets you crazy relativism. It doesn't entail anything goes relativism. It's a framework for analysis of how transformative criticism can arise within a discipline. It does require a degree of tolerance for certain kinds of pluralism, moderate pluralism, and it requires a thorough rethink of what we mean by objectivity. So with that much on the table, I hope I'm not over time, just one response to the second question. Before that, in the last decade, I've been thinking this through in terms of what the transformative effects are of archaeologists building, seriously engaging in partnerships with indigenous communities, doing work in partnership with indigenous communities, doing work on questions that indigenous communities would make a priority, working for indigenous communities. And again, I would argue there's considerable epistemic advantage, constructive and critical. Critical eye on what's been assumed and constructive opening up of possibilities. So the implications for generalizing comparative archaeology, it seems to me what's crucial here is to recognize that the aims of inquiry, there's this world of philosophy of science, aims approach to values in science, that the aims of inquiry, which reflect the situated interests of those who do it, individuals and institutions, configure every aspect of the research process. It doesn't just start, like, throw the question in, and then you have this value-free zone and the work gets done, and then you throw an answer out, and there's like a not value-free zone where you put it to, you use the results, right? And this doesn't entail kind of wish fulfillment, relativism, again, make it up however you want, kind of claims, influence on conclusions. But it does mean that the research agenda is framed in terms of substantive assumptions about what it is you're studying, the categories that you're describing, what's of interest, what questions are sensible to ask, what possible answers, hypotheses are plausible to consider, what's going to count as a credible answer. And it also entails that, makes a difference to what kind of inductive risk, as philosophers would describe it, inductive risk you're willing to take when you're drawing conclusions on the basis of your empirical work. You can certainly find out you're wrong. That's the virtue of sharply focused hypotheses, systematic data collection and analysis. But there may be a whole range of insights about what you're studying, aspects of what you're studying that you haven't considered, complicating factors, alternative hypotheses, confounds, that other questions and other aims could bring into focus. So again, what this entails is a thoroughgoing fallibilism, a preparedness to recognize the limitations of what seems like the best way to do the work you're doing, and a moderate pluralism. So taking account of dissident perspectives, or better yet, critical standpoints on knowledge production, I think can only enrich generalizing and comparative approaches to archaeology, making clear what their strengths and limitations are. I'd say the same about any approach, but I think it's true in that, in that respect as well. There.
Very much. That was fascinating. Are there any follow-up comments or questions from the panelists to what Allison had to say about perspectivism and standpoint?
How could you say these things?
So Allison, you've been regarded from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
It's not something that we read about much now, but that was one of his major points.
There are a number of threads in the Binford literature, which I went down that rabbit hole in a serious and mind-numbing way as a grad student. And I mean, tangled up with other stuff that I thought are really, and I keep pulling them forward and finding them. And then there are earlier things, like Chamberlain, the geologist, who gets cited in he's like late 19th century, multiple hypotheses, multiple working hypotheses paper that gets cited by archaeologists up through the mid-century, just before Binford. I guess that paper was republished in Science, and it got some uptake. And it's a quirky paper in some ways, because it's all framed in terms of like not favoring just one of your children, the children being hypotheses, right? But the sentiment is there in quite mainstream, and in this case adjacent disciplines, that you really ought to be pursuing multiple lines. Like, if there's one true story to be told, say my philosophy of science colleagues, the Minnesota pluralists, and you cultivate multiple lines of inquiry, you'll eventually get there. But if there isn't just one true story to be told, and you all pile on to one path forward, because it's showing some success and it seems like the right way, it seems plausible, seems like the right way to do business, you're missing a whole range of possibilities. It's a kind of Pascal's wager. So even if you think there's one true story, you might want to tolerate a number of, favor many children hypotheses and many ways of doing business. Yeah.
Right. I think African diasporic scholars have been actually performing that since the 19th century. They've recognized that they have a different vantage and a different view on the common conclusions of white scholarship, from Frederick Douglass responding to Morton, to Antonin Firmin responding at the end of the 19th century to de Gobineau, to Du Bois, talking about veils between communities and their epistemic, really, double consciousness that African Americans know the white perspective. They know them very well and intimately through their work, if nothing else. But they also know their own perspective, their own homes, their own societies into which whites did not intrude in their domestic lives. So, so I think this is, you know, it's an acknowledged, almost quite an assumed fact of African American life, that white people believe they understand the world because they talk and listen to themselves, but that they don't understand the world as African Americans and other diasporic people do, because those people live in two worlds, at least. They know what white people think, and they know what they think, and they develop their own intellectual traditions. So it's a practice of what you're describing.
Yeah, that's actually what you're describing is pivotal for the development of standpoint theory, feminist and critical race, like exactly the legacy of this. And there's also a strong methodological tradition, at least in the feminist uptake of these themes, and they typically are drawing on Du Bois. I'm thinking of Dorothy Smith and others about starting from, and Haraway, starting from the margins, trying to identify what questions or insights would be, could drive inquiry that are specifically not the ones that have been defining the mainstream and the center. But it's maybe been more of a struggle for white feminists to take this on. In the sense that it wasn't an established tradition in the way that it was in critical race theory. Yeah.
Let me go ahead and move on to the next question. Thank you very much, Allison, and Michael, and Jerry. Next question's for Patricia. You have worked hard to involve local people in your archaeological field research. In particular, you support them in efforts to build indigenous heritage systems through your leadership of various organizations, including Inherit. So I was wondering, what does collaborative community archaeology mean for a generalizing, some might say, scientific archaeology? Are they compatible?
Well, the short answer is yes, in a way, they are. Thank you, Mike, for that very interesting and thought-provoking question. And I'd like to follow up on some lines of thought that Allison and Michael just introduced by saying that, there are many ways of knowing and understanding the past. Archaeology is one very powerful and very privileged way of understanding the past, but it's not the only way. So, and I think it's interesting, a few decades ago, several decades ago, many of you in this room are way too young to remember this, but archaeologists began reaching out to mainly indigenous communities in North America and trying to do some collaborative work. And they came back and reported back that, wow, there's some Native people. We start talking about understanding the past, studying the past. And they say, what do you mean? It's not the past. It's not in the past. It's in the present. And so we can see, so there's like, whoa, this basic sort of incommensurability right off the bat, like, what is the past? Some people seem to feel that the past really isn't in the past. And so it kind of, so then I have, and I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who have just confided in me that they are just so, they're really frightened, really, to do collaborative work. And I mean, I wanted to mention that what Barbara talked about earlier and what's happening here at Michigan, it's just really phenomenal. It's so powerful and it's so positive. But, some archaeologists seem to feel that, well, if I work with a community and I'm collaborating with them, and then we come up with very different understandings of the past. Or we have a disagreement, or they don't like my radiocarbon dates, what am I going to do then? And so this is an issue, and this is really, really frightens, is very frightening to some archaeologists. But I think it's really only a problem for us if we're taking more of an attitude of it's my way or the highway, and that there is really only one way of knowing the past. And I think that archaeology has now gotten to the point where we've matured enough that we can confront these tensions between archaeological interests and heritage claims. And so the desires and needs of a group with a claim to archaeological places and materials. So I wrote a bit about this in Maya Cultural Heritage. I just don't think we have the luxury any longer of living in this bubble, which is just, archaeologists and the stuff of the past. And we're in this kind of intense dyadic relationship. It's gotten a lot larger than that. And so I think it's kind of time to kind of move away from that modus operandi. I don't know, Mike's asking me about scientific comparative archaeology, and so I guess, we all have to think about what is science. Many of us, certainly those of us who are archaeologists sitting around this table here, were trained to think about scientific technique in the framework of a kind of positivism, posing questions, seeking evidence to evaluate the questions and hypotheses. But where do we get those questions from? It's not from just simply staring into our almond milk latte in the morning. The questions that we ask come from a number of sources. And we have, once again, archaeologists have complained to me that they cannot accept a scenario in which a community might determine what their research questions and priorities are, that would not be objective according to a sort of an uber scientific kind of approach to understanding the past. But where do these questions come from? Once again, those of many graduate students in the room here, how do you get your questions for that you're going to follow up for your dissertation research? And those of us who advise students, we know that this is a very difficult process, isn't it? How do you come up with a good research question? Well, I find that many times what I do is go into the field, and my research questions are fine-tuned and grounded through some kind of preliminary field research, conversations with local people. So I think if we're being completely honest with ourselves, we have to admit that communities have always shaped our research questions. But they just haven't received any credit for it. So it's been more of an extractive relationship than a collaborative one. Well, how do we decide where to look for evidence? Once again, some archaeologists really chafe at the thought of being constrained by community-imposed restrictions. But in reality, those of us who do field research know that we are always being constrained geographically by unfriendly ranchers and farmers who will not allow us access to their land. This happens even in Mexico, where I work, where INA supposedly owns all archaeological remains. They're supposed to be the property of the state. But there's kind of a joke in Mesoamerican archaeology that aggressive guard dogs have played an outsized role in, what we know about the past, and increasingly also African killer bees. And so there are these factors that impinge upon us and shape our research and make it something that, if we're honest with ourselves, is really it looks less and less like this objective kind of endeavor. Bench science, maybe the last bastion of scientific research, according to some, and surely not a place where community collaboration is needed. Well, if you just think for a moment and consider the flack that was raised by the unauthorized archaeological DNA analysis of deceased humans from Chaco Canyon, you begin to think that maybe sometimes it is better to ask permission than to ask forgiveness, especially when dealing with people who historically have been dispossessed and alienated from their ancestors. I kind of think that archaeologists have been missing the boat when it comes to community collaborative projects. I'm doing a community collaborative project right now in a little town called Tacabo in Yucatan, Mexico. And I just remember one time listening to Maya Diedrich, one of my former graduate students who did her undergraduate work here, report to the community on some materials that had been sent up to the States for more extensive materials analysis. And there was pride in those, in the faces of people in that audience, because they felt that materials from their small community, archaeological materials, were important enough to travel up to the States and be analyzed, and that when that analysis was complete, they would find out about it, and it would be reported in their community museum. And in fact, it has been. So I think that what I see is, as particularly with indigenous communities, is very deeply seated empiricism and curiosity. And that is oftentimes, it's the secondary thing that we see, because first, the factors that come to play are the fact that people have survived colonialism and worse, and that there's a tremendous amount of mistrust that has been sown over the years, so that archaeologists, in fact, do have to work to build trust with communities in order to enfranchise people and to generate this kind of trust that would allow this kind of scientific analysis to happen. Finally, a little bit about ontologies, and I know this is really a buzzword within anthropology right now, but I think that it's really worthwhile for archaeologists to think about grappling really seriously with different ontologies in reference to not only what might have existed in the past, but also, and significantly, contemporary approaches to understanding how things come into being, how they go out of being. I'm working on this paper right now called Hurtful Heritage, and it probably has something to do with the fact that just a few years ago, a Confederate monument was taken down right outside my office at UNC Chapel Hill. And so I read this essay by Georges Simmel called The Ruin. Many of you may have had occasion to look at it. And it reads like a romantic tragedy. And he's talking about these old, dead places and, the romance of this. And it kind of sounds like an abandoned Maya city, right? But, really it's completely at odds with how some Kekchi people today view those abandoned cities. There's a really interesting piece by Marcus Ebel and Santiago Chochak, who write that Kekchi Maya people view old structures, the people they were working with, as embodiments of great power and animacy in the present rather than dead things in the past. And that's why if you visit archaeological sites in Guatemala today, you will always see people there, ethnically Maya people there, making prayers and offerings at those places, because they're not dead things of the past. They're living things that have great power today. So is this compatible with archaeological research? Well, not really. But then again, you know, it really doesn't have to be. I think all that is needed is for archaeologists to accept the fact that going forward, it's better to engage with the incompatibilities, to embrace them, rather than to run away from them. So, and I think that if we do that, I think that there is a great future ahead for what Mike would refer to as scientific archaeology. And I know I went a little bit over my time.
Any follow-ups to that? I mean, I think any of us who work in the field appreciate what you have to say, Tricia, about you can't do field work without having some interaction with local people. So we've really been practicing collaborative archaeology all along, but we haven't been very honest about it in our collaborations. At least that's what I think. We talk about that in the museum all the time. Anyone else have any thoughts? Collaborative community archaeology?
Well, extraction and collaboration are different things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So maybe trying to get away from extraction towards real collaboration. Actually, Michael, the next question is for you. So it's a two-parter. You told me recently that you were actually greatly affected by the new archaeology. So maybe you could say a little bit about that. But then as a follow-up, how have your changing views about archaeology affected your work in various socially and politically charged archaeological arenas, most notably the New York African Burial Grounds Project?
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me? I do appreciate you asking about my connection with the new archaeology. Being here, I haven't been here for 25 years, and rapidly approaching 70 years of age, I reminisce. So, of course, Michigan was at the center of the effort to make archaeology a science, moving beyond its antiquarian roots. And although an avocational archaeologist since childhood, I took my first college courses in archaeology, including Mesoamerican archaeology and African archaeology, in the early 1970s from a former Michigan graduate student teaching at Howard University. Laura Henley Dean was an African-American woman from Washington, also my hometown, who had studied with Kent Flannery. In fact, she had excavated, as I recall, at Monte Alban. So I was initiated into the new archaeology in its heyday. As a junior at Howard, I focused on Maya archaeology. I was fortunate enough to have been afforded time to study under Betty Benson's loose supervision at Dumbarton Oaks before I set off for Belize. There I conducted my own survey for a month on the periphery of Cerro Maya, hosted by David Friedel, who put me up at his camp. That successful mapping, however, led to my dissatisfaction with archaeological science. And although I don't know his relationship to Michigan, I see him as a new archaeologist. I tried Norman Hammond's planar model of spatial analysis and found that I could have come to multiple and contradictory conclusions using the same model. I naively thought I would find more objective data as a biological anthropologist, having already conducted a study in paleopathology at the Smithsonian, and that's another story. But I was wrong. So as I pursued biocultural anthropology and bioarchaeology as a UMass graduate student, I was assisted by the African Diasporic Scholarship I also learned at Howard to look for politics and ideology in the history of anthropology. I continued to interrogate the intrinsic subjectivity of empirical knowledge and found it over and over again. It was clearly and empirically an inescapable fact of the human, even scientific gaze, that intrinsic subjectivity. Ultimately, the clientage model I developed for the African Burial Ground Project in New York assumes that research is always subjective to a vantage point. Yet, material evidence remains fundamental to its scientific pursuit. What does one do with that dilemma? What we did not do was default to denial on that project. The choice of a descendant community's vantage was made, partly because it makes mortuary research, at least, ethical, that we were working for their descendants. We found the democratization of knowledge that occurs when one works for descendant communities also improves the range and significance of the questions archaeologists, historians, and biological anthropologists ask. We would answer those questions, however, only so far as the evidence took us. And in that way, assumed the existence of subjectivity and the use of what, Allison, we were talking about earlier, I call it objectivity number one, which is the object. This is what science involves, observation of material evidence. That's often confounded with a notion of neutrality, which in fact cannot, or universality, which actually can't be demonstrated with objectivity number one. We call that objectivity two. But temporal knowledge, certainly possible. I don't know if this question relates to these social justice initiatives you had asked about. And yes, my work and that of others I've worked with pursues the goals of activist scholarship, which began, as I was mentioning, in the 19th century African diasporic intellectual tradition that stood counter to the reductionist and racist foundations of anthropology. Frederick Douglass's Claims of the Negro, Ethnologically Considered, is a foundational document in that tradition. He creates the nurture argument in 1854 in response to Notting Gliddon's Types of Mankind, the first broadly disseminated racial determinism. That's a counter argument and understanding. It says it's the circumstances that create the man in his gendered language, not biology. We acknowledge, and he also says the neutral scholar is an ignoble man. Neutrality is not possible. No one else claims, the other civic leaders don't claim to be neutral. Why how can Samuel Morton claim to be neutral? You're either for us or against us, and he's talking about the justification of slavery or its critique. We acknowledge whose side we are on rather than to take the side of apology for the status quo, which has included white supremacy, while claiming without evidence, as I've said, to be neutral and universal. Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment notions of such objectivity are bound up with notions of white and Christian authority, and that requires a sort of a deep dive into the history of Enlightenment thought, but there you will find the connections. The anthropology I do informs and is informed by descendant communities, opening the conversation to the research questions of diverse social vantages rather than the white so-called mainstream in which anthropology is usually embedded. In other words, white anthropologists tend to operate within an intellectually gated community. Deference to the descendants of those whose histories one writes opens the door to more fully critical, paradigmatic perspectives and research that is more useful to the other. They, Black, brown, and Native, are welcome to be empowered in our conversations about the past. So the new National Trust for Historic Preservation's 2018 rubric for engaging descendant communities is an example of how the New York project, which began 30 years ago, has come to influence institutions for the writing of history. That document affords descendant communities full empowerment and as a equal partnership in telling their stories of America in which slavery is centered. So from the U.S. National Monument to the African Burial Ground, to the current memorialization efforts of a truly empowered descendant community at James Madison's Montpelier. I don't know if you saw that battle in the press. The new ethically acquired narratives of Black people become visible on the landscapes of social and political knowledge and change. Social justice initiatives. White supremacy is interstitial in American life. That includes the controlling narratives of what one should expect of society. The history of those expectations is often convenient to the occupiers and not the occupied. Throughout the history of American archaeology, the occupiers have studied, interpreted the causes and expectations of the occupied. I advocate that the occupied speak of their past and expectations of their own free will. This requires their empowerment, their ability to say yes or no to research. Not always as, sometimes an equal voice, but when it comes to ancestral remains, the human tradition has been that the family makes the decision about its own ancestors' disposition. And in this sense, descendant communities are surrogate family. Not the neighbors, not the rest of the congregation, and certainly not historic adversaries who live across the street. Archaeologists, nonetheless, may serve them with evidence working for those communities. And then finally, I would say, one may say, I've always opposed racist science and historical narratives. But how would you know? Have you listened to and followed the critical intellectual traditions of the other, beyond tokens that allow one to comfortably return to the epistemic parameters of the gated white community with one's sense of fairness affirmed? Probably not, according to Beliso de Jesus and Pierre's surveys of anthropological syllabi. And this is a special issue of American Anthropologist in 2020, where they demonstrate the gating, the eliminating of the voice, other than a few tokens, perhaps for that purpose I've described, from discussions of African diasporic scholars, among other eccentric, as Faye Harrison describes the other's point of view and intellectual traditions, from the conversation in the anthropological classroom, from the canon. So we who studied colonial New York invited the other's community voices into the room, and that has made all the difference.
Thank you, Michael, for those powerful words. I think what you're saying is we have work to do still in anthropology and in archaeology. I also think one thing you said I think was important, that when we enter into these relationships, we ask descendant communities the question yes or no, and we have to be ready for the possibility that in some cases they're going to say no.
Absolutely.
Something we haven't been very good at.
In my institute, where we continue to work only if on human skeletal remains, only if their descendants approve. We actually worked for had a project, a big project with the General Assembly of the state of Virginia, to go out and ask folks how they wanted to commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. And at any rate, there was no interest. I mean, we were bioarchaeologists. Well, we could help them have conversations, which is what they wanted, about resistance. That's an African-American question about slavery. We wanted to see the resistance. Where's the evidence of the resistance disappears from so much of the interpretation, because then you ask, well, what were they resisting? They were resisting the brutality of the founding fathers, in the view of others. So that question doesn't come up at Colonial Williamsburg. So they wanted to talk about resistance. They wanted signage. We helped with these memorialization activities as we can as academics. But at times, as at the moment, there's a First Baptist Church at Colonial Williamsburg, an 18th century church that the archaeologists there wanted to excavate. They gave permission. They determined that questions that were worthy of our work as far as they were concerned. And so we are pursuing those questions in our laboratory on 3 individuals' remains. They came to visit us last week to see how we were doing. And it was such a positive emotional and intellectual experience. Far better than, as I said to one of the archaeologists, this is a lot better than having people grit on you. This was a kind of embrace, and so they said, well, we'd like more work to be done. But that, if it's their decision, then it complies with the ethical standard of informed consent. And the African Burial Ground is the first project, bioarchaeological project anyway, that operated in these terms of informed consent. And so it's the first ethical bioarchaeology. Yeah. And we can do that indefinitely, but the power relations need to change between the communities.
Any follow-up questions or comments from the panel? Additional thoughts? My next question's for David Hurst Thomas. Dave, you have spent your career at the American Museum of Natural History. You wrote the critically acclaimed book Skull Wars. So what does the future of archaeology museums look like? Do they have a role to play in studying and understanding past human behaviors?
That's a hard yes or no question. And what I'm going to do is, that's a very practical question too. And I'm going to deal with some practicalities. A lot of archaeologists in the room, and at least they've heard it, if they don't believe it, about if you don't learn the lessons from the past, you're destined to repeat them. I'm not so sure we're so good at that. So let me just tell you a couple of stories, museum stories. And I'm going to start, not with my museum, I'll get to that. But let me start with when NAGPRA came in as pending legislation. It's often forgotten that it was paired with a new museum. The National Museum of the American Indian, that was all part of the same deal. And it was considered that they'd sort of maybe counterbalance each other. I don't know about that. But it certainly impacted me because in 1989, I got a call from an archaeologist, Bob Adams, who just happened to be the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. And we'd known each other some, and he said, "I've got a job for you." And I said, "I've got a job." And he says, "No, this is a different one. We're creating this new museum, and the law is just about set on what that board is going to look like. And it's going to be 80% Native American, and it turned out to be Native Hawaiian. It got changed a little bit. And a couple of very rich people, and one token white scholar. And he said, "I'd like you to do that." And he said, "Huh?" And I said, "Huh?" And he said, "How come?" And he says, "Because you know things they don't know. You know two things. You know something about museum collections and being a museum curator, done that for a couple of decades, and you're a professional archaeologist and a North American archaeologist. You know their history." And so I said, "Okay," and agreed to do it, and became exactly what I just described. So as we started having meetings in 1989, I explained to them how I viewed archaeology, museums, and their past. Now, to put me in some perspective, I'm an Alfred Kroeber grandson. All my major professors at the University of California, Davis, were Kroeber students. So what I learned in graduate school was Kroeber's view of what anthropology is. And okay, that's great. Kroeber was a great man. Had his name on a hall for a while. All right, so I'm going to go do my doctoral dissertation in the Reese River Valley of Nevada. And I went to my professors and I said, "Hey, the area we picked out here is about 25 miles from an Indian reservation, Western Shoshone Reservation. What do I do about that?" And they said, "Lie to them." Because you have to remember coming down from Kroeber, all the real Indians are dead. These Indians have become cowboys. And you want nothing to do with them because they know nothing about their own history, and they're going to get in your way of writing that history. So that's exactly what I did. I had 3 field schools, one University of Nevada, 2 University of California. And when the tribe would come up once in a while and join my campfire, we lied and said we were geologists. And we did that because I was told by my professors that you are the expert here. If you do well in school and you get your 4 degrees at Davis, which I did, you're going to go out and you're going to know the history that they don't know and they don't care about. And if they ever get interested in learning that history, they can read your books, they can read your articles, and they can listen to your testimony in court because you're the expert. So that's the anthropology I took to the National Museum of the American Indian. When NAGPRA came out, I was against it. Most archaeologists were against it. Most museums were against it. And this was sort of a sop. The Smithsonian was going to do an exhibit. Well, you can imagine how far that attitude got me on my board as the token white academic. And fast forward, I was on that board for 15 years as a founding trustee, so I had lots of experience with this. But it's an odd thing. That's an old High Foundation collection by a private collector who insisted on writing his name, all the catalog numbers on everything. And so it became an awesome collection. And as we were meeting and trying to define what should an Indian-run museum look like, all they could think of was, it can't look like the museum where he works. Okay, so, but the archaic part of it was, because it was a collection made by a collector, everything the board did, everything about the collection came directly to the board. So if there was a request to do some kind of sampling, if there was a loan, if there was anything like this, it was a board matter, and so that became my job, to speak. They wanted, so we have a request to do radiocarbon dating. So I would explain what radiocarbon dating is. And one of my fellow trustees, Vine Deloria, said, radiocarbon dating doesn't work. It's a scam. It's a way to screw Indians. Well, no, and so we didn't really agree to disagree, we just disagreed. And so I was going on and making another report and another meeting, and we're in the castle of all great places at the Smithsonian, having this fancy board meeting. And I'm going on about something related to the collection, and this voice comes from the other corner of the room, distinctly Suzanne Schoen Harjo's voice, who says someone in this room needs to take Indian 101. And I think I'm going to start those lessons right now. I had a tough time, and I got reelected for a second term, and at one point I was unanimously elected as vice chairman of the entire museum. Now what happened there? Going in, I told you what I thought going in. But what happened was the book that Mike mentioned, Skull Wars. It's what I learned when I was a member of that board. I learned 10 times what I learned in graduate school about Native Americans because I was in the middle of it. And I was finding out where I was wrong. So Skull Wars is the story of how museums, natural history museums in this country were formed. And it's not a pretty story. This book so irritated my museum. We had considerable words about it. There's some stories in here about what were called Piri Eskimos that were brought to the museum, a fake funeral that Kroeber did on our grounds when the bones were already upstairs with numbers on them. About some of the stuff Boaz did before we hired him to bring the four-field approach to anthropology. He would light a fire in one end of the Northwest Coast village so he could go dig up the skulls that he could sell to finance his expedition. This is before he worked for us. And I quote his letter to his wife saying, you know, it's nasty work, but somebody's got to do it. That's a pretty ugly story. But the best part about Skull Wars is the preface. Because you know who wrote it? Vine Deloria. And Vine and I became great friends in that process. And he ended up writing the introduction to this, far best part of the book. And it starts out, when I read this manuscript, my anger was incandescent. And he goes on about, you know, how we need stories like this told. And he actually called me brave for telling the story. Now, that's a lesson in there. I went in with some really outmoded anthropology ideas, and I came away thinking something entirely different. That museum learned a lot too. It's interesting that we have this huge collection that comes to the Smithsonian, run by an Indian board, and repatriation's not an issue for the first decade. Why? Not because things didn't need to be repatriated, but because in the quest for what does it mean to be a museum, the answer is it means you have a collection. And when the idea of the collection took hold with this board, that became a governing factor, even though the board, on one side of the table, Native American people, and on the other side, Native American people. It took a very strong push from the board to even consider repatriation. There was a museum to build. There was a collection space that needed to be done. The museum part of it became, the collection part of it, became a self-fulfilling prophecy that was working in there, and it finally had to get changed. So there's a lesson in there. Let me tell you another story. I came to my museum in New York 50 years ago, literally this month, my anniversary. So part of what those 50 years I overlapped with Margaret Mead for 6 years. And as to truly prove that God has a sense of humor, I was the chairman at age 30 of our department, and Margaret Mead was in my department. She called me the whippersnapper and a lot of this stuff. But it was, so when Margaret died, it was my job to kind of oversee, first of all, what we do with the archives. Unfortunately, those went to the Library of Congress. But the rest of it, how do we deal with the collection that she brought back in her research? And she was very proud of the collection. She spent the last 3 years of her life building that Pacific Hall. And it was critical for her to get those artifacts out there. So we got a notice from the Admiralty Islands, from Manus, from Perry Village. They wanted to come a year after Margaret Mead died to the museum. And I thought, holy, we're already having repatriation conversations. Even back then, this is a dozen years before the law was passed, and you could just see it coming. And the representative was this guy named John Killipack. And if you go back through Mead's publication, she first went to Perry Village in 1928, just a couple of years after she came to the museum, and there's a picture of her holding this baby, John Killipack. Then she went back after World War II, New Lives for Old, and what she's talking about, he is then one of her chief consultants. And the story there is how they went through the John Frum cult and all of World War II. They literally threw away all the artifacts they had because they wanted the things that the Christians were showing up with. It happened all over the Pacific, but particularly in Melanesia. So Killipack, when Margaret Mead died, was the spokesman for the entire village at that point, and said, I want to come and talk to you a year after so we can end our mourning for Margaret Mead. And I said, okay. But I could see a veiled repatriation going here. We just opened this hall. She collected about 80 things from her first visit, and they destroyed their own material culture right after that. There was nothing left. And about 75% of that collection is in the Margaret Mead Pacific Hall. So John Killipack shows up, and he presents us with a necklace of their coins, which is now in the hall right next to Mead's Medal of Freedom. And he said, he finished, he made nice remarks, and he said, and now we're going to talk about the collection. And I thought, whoa, here we go. And I said, what do you want to talk about? And he says, well, you know we don't have any of this. We don't have the obsidian spears. We don't have the dog-tooth necklaces. We don't have the phalluses with shell on them. We don't have any of that stuff. It's all gone. And you've got it. Uh-huh. And so what are you asking me? And he said, I'm asking you for really good pictures of all of these cases so that we can install those in the Margaret Mead Cultural Center that we're establishing, because we want to show that how Perry Village got to Broadway. We are so proud that you have those on display. Keep them there. So, I was kind of wrong on that one too. And he said, I sort of went a little bit further. How come you feel like that? And he said, well, we don't here in the Admiralty Islands, museum is not a concept that we have. We hear about museums other places, but what we've done is develop a pidgin, Neo-Melanesian term for it. And he said, house called you. I couldn't understand what that term for a museum was, and I had him repeat it again. I still couldn't understand it, and so I had him write it out. And what the Neo-Melanesian term for a museum, house, look, belong, all. House, look, belong, all. And he was saying that's why we need museums like yours, to show what we're like to other people around the world. So I learned something there. I thank Patricia for mentioning the Chaco DNA study. And I'm going to add a little other story here. We granted permission to do DNA analysis to a team of bones from room 33 at Pueblo Bonito. I was the decision maker on this because after Ian Tattersall retired, I was the curator of our biological collections for a decade. And so we went through and looked at where do we stand with repatriation in the Southwest, and we didn't stand in a very good place. We did lots of consultation, and we got it, and the best we could do under the law was to come back to P4. After Mesa Verde was abandoned, after Chaco was abandoned, it was possible under the law to establish affiliations with many of the pueblos. And we did lots of repatriations because my museum with Nels Nelson did a lot of work on those P4 sites. So, but we got stalled out right at the Great Drought because we couldn't make any of those connections that were required under the law. So we had a proposal come to me. What we need to do is do some DNA on those. And if we do the DNA on the bones, we can affiliate exactly which tribes ought to be, and we can proceed with the repatriation of Pueblo Bonito. Okay, and I looked at the science, their DNA I thought was good, all of this, we had the collection. So the researchers made the case to me, and I thought, that's a tough decision because it's not going to be popular, but I think it's probably what we need to get over the hump in order to get on with the repatriation. Well, what about consultation with the tribes? Well, that's what we're trying to figure out is who are the right tribes? We don't know that. And so, well, but can you just go ahead and do it? Well, there's nothing actually in NAGPRA that talks about research. So the question was, did our research objectives justify doing that? And the consultation issue, I didn't know what to do because I'm not a Southwestern specialist, but I listened to some of the best Southwestern specialists in the world. And my advice, their advice to me was uniform. Don't do it. That what you're going to do is talk to a number of tribes, and some of them are going to agree, and some of them are not going to agree, and what you're going to do is insert your museum into tribal politics in a way that we just can't have. So your goal is right. Let's pursue NAGPRA, but just go ahead and do the dating. And I did. Now, this isn't technically my decision because we have a committee, but we also have curators, and the job of the loan committee is to rubber stamp through whatever the curator does to kind of take the heat off the curator. Well, I certainly got my share of heat on that, and there's going to be a lot more coming out very soon. I was just talking to a reporter yesterday. What that decision that we did, making up our minds about proceeding with what we thought was good in Indian country and not doing the consultation on it because of the potential political problems is probably right now the poster child of screwing up in NAGPRA. There was a piece that was written a couple of years ago. NSF had a big grant to study problems with ancient DNA research. And that just came to the surface right away as a problem. So an article was written and they interviewed me about what happened. And I went on at great length. I screwed up. I made a mistake. Here's what I was trying to do. But because NAGPRA does not deal with research, I was trying to get my museum to obey the law, and we were trying to further repatriation. And what we did instead was make a real mess. And so my name was, what still is in parts, I'm the bad guy, and I'm still doing interviews about it. I think I will say that my loudest Pueblo critic 5 years ago, we've talked about it, and we are now co-curating a show together about Chaco Canyon. But the bottom line here is, and getting back to the original question about museum anthropology, I think you've got to admit when you're wrong. I was wrong when I went to the Indian Museum. That's where Skull Wars came from. I had it wrong in dealing with the Admiralty Islands. Worked out okay because they wanted what I wanted, but I had it all wrong, and I really had it wrong in the Southwest. And I think that what we've got to do as we work through with more collaborative exhibitions, it comes back to that collection. That's what makes natural history museums tick. And collections about that, it's our greatest strength and it's our biggest weakness. And we're going to make mistakes. My museum is even starting to admit its mistakes. We just took down that awful Teddy Roosevelt statue that all the anthros had been unanimous for 10 years it needs to come down. And it's not so much, you can make a case pro or con on Theodore Roosevelt. I've done a couple of exhibits on him at the museum. My museum's charter was signed in his father's parlor. He grew up in our halls. He went off to Harvard to become a curator at my museum, and the politics got in the way. So he is part of my museum is the state of New York's monument to him as a former governor of New York. But it's topped off with a statue of TR on this great big horse and an African walking on this side and an Indian walking over here. Why does it look like that? It was made in 1930 as a tribute. It was made like that because the president of our museum was the chief spokesman for eugenics way after. He was president for 25 years of our museum, and while that was perhaps defensible science in the 1920s, the museum hosted 2 eugenics conferences in the 30s when it was thoroughly recognized as bad science. And the story is when Hitler finally got in power, the first book he wanted translated into German was his, about how race works. So we had a statue of a hero, and I still have a lot of time for TR. He wrote some awful things, but he also, after he was president, kind of turned some of that around. But the eugenics statement that's so very clear in that statue had to go. It was painted red my first year at the museum 50 years ago, and we were still getting protests on it. So as we did that, what we were not going to do is destroy it. We're not the Taliban. We need to do something better with it. And fortunately, we could work with the Roosevelt family, and it's going to go be in the new presidential library in the Dakotas. So it's not going to be destroyed. It's not going to be blown up. And how they deal with, maybe the eugenics question isn't such an issue there. It's by a very famous artist. But as the front door to my museum, it is exactly the wrong statement. So we were wrong there. We were wrong in hosting the eugenics conferences, and I actually got to put pictures of those in the exhibit that I did about TR. So I think even in an outfit that I work for, a huge natural history museum, we're starting to get the idea that it's okay to admit you were wrong, and probably that's where the progress is going to come from when more of us are willing to do that. So thank you for mentioning that. I wasn't going to talk about that, but...
Thanks, Dave. Any follow-up questions? comments?
I wasn't trying to put you on the spot.
No, you didn't
but
mention my name.
Thank you for your honesty and just the way that you put it out there like that. I love that.
I think that's what we've got to do. That if we're going to make any progress in the museum business, and probably a lot of the rest of it, I think we've got to be willing to talk about our own history and say, we made these mistakes. Look what I did with the Indians in my dissertation. But that to just own up to it, gee, that's what Kroeber taught us, his granddad. I think we've got to be willing to, if we're going to make this thing work, to be realistic and critical of our own history.
Thanks. We're running over time, so I'm going to go to the last question, which is for Jerry Sabloff. Jerry, given everything we've just heard, is there a future for archaeological theory? It seems that through time, archaeologists have swung back and forth between various seemingly opposed poles, views. The general versus the specific, science versus humanism, objectivity versus subjectivity, process versus context, activism versus neutrality, and so on. I wonder if a quote-unquote middle way is possible, one that balances all of the above. What do you think? Is that possible?
So, time is short. I could echo both Allison and Tricia and say the answers to your two questions: is there a future for archaeological theory, and is a middle way possible that balances all of those dichotomies? The answers to both are yes. But let me rephrase what you've said, because I think if one looks, say, at the last half century plus of archaeology, in a general sense, what strikes one is the advances in technique and in method. There have been huge advances in those areas. I mean, one could go on, for hours on technique, from radiocarbon dating. We just heard about neutron activation. In my area, LIDAR have really revolutionized a lot of the practical work that archaeologists do, and a lot of the empirical data that comes from that research. And the second is in methodology. Over 2 decades ago, the late Wendy Ashmore and I argued that settlement pattern studies, as one example of an important, was really kind of critical in changing the nature of archaeology over the last half century. The holistic approach of looking at rich and poor, elite, non-elite, rural, urban, and so on, have come about because of the methodology of settlement pattern studies around the world. And then certainly the comparative method, as Henry was talking about. But in fact, if you think about what are the great advances in theory since, say, the middle of the 20th century, the answer is not so much. I think, interestingly, and Allison can correct me if my usage is wrong, there are a lot of really stimulating and interesting hypotheses that one sees in all kinds of areas of archaeological thinking, but not a lot of theory. Certainly, one can give examples, but if you were to say, what's the highlight of archaeology since post-World War II period, it would not be the great advances in archaeological theory, in my thing. So to rephrase what Michael asked would be, how can one move from many exciting hypotheses to an archaeology where theory could be stimulated and advanced? And given the context of what we heard from all the panelists today, that's not going to be necessarily easy. But I think it's a worthwhile goal, I think, in terms of major topics today that interest archaeology in particular, but the world in general, from inequality, climate change, the growth of cities, let alone more practical questions of the preservation of archaeological heritage and the rights of indigenous peoples. These are areas that archaeology and archaeologists are tackling, and that could use a strong theoretical basis that I don't think is really there. So my answer, Michael, is not a negative one in terms of is there a future for archaeology. I think the answer is yes, but we have to do a hell of a lot better job than we've done in recent years to do that. How can we move from the incredible pattern recognition that we see in a lot of archaeological studies to explanations that are broadly acceptable given the incredible complexity of human cultures? I think it's a huge challenge and one I think the field can meet, but we haven't done that yet. So that would be my short and simple answer to your two questions.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I have a question. In your shop in Santa Fe, resilience theory, a great deal has been done on that. To me, very impressive work over the last decade. Do you see that as a step in theory building? It certainly is a broad general theory, and what's come out of the people working with you, these incredible databases and the way we can do it, is that theory building?
The answer, and I think I mean, the other example I would use would be scaling laws and how that's now being applied to urban growth and not only urban situations, but pre-industrial urban situations. So I think that there's a lot of promise there. But in terms of archaeology, we're just seeing the very beginnings. I think a lot, resistant theory is a good example. I think scaling is as well, and there's certainly others when you look at complex adaptive systems, and certainly the recent work in looking at ecology from new perspectives in relation to long-term changes. So in fact, my answer is, I think, is an optimistic one, but it's tempered by what I think is the overall lack of progress in the last half century plus.
Here's a thought. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, a thought about a kind of theory building. And I think one of the things that's going to be needed is to pull the conceptual framing, to go back to your comment right at the beginning, pull the conceptual framing away from the immense body of data which you can now manipulate in much more sophisticated ways than ever before. Because that conceptual framing embeds a set of assumptions that for the most part, I think you need to do these critical historical genealogies to find out how the assumptions that framed research a century, 150 years ago, how those are built into the conceptual infrastructure with which you're working at the level of descriptive categories, analytic categories. And you may see that may be pushed by theoretical innovation, but it may be also required to begin to think outside the box a bit and do theoretical innovation of a kind that would advance the field at this point. So this is a thought about how critical histories of archaeology, what were the questions? Why were they framed that way? Why were the descriptive and analytic categories designed in the way they were? That's going to be, I think, a crucial part of the creative push at this juncture to realize the potential of archaeological theory and archaeological inquiry in the future.
I couldn't agree more, but at the same time, we know our colleagues, all of us, are very resistant to that kind of basic change. I'm just thinking in my own area, Maya studies, I think 40 years ago, I wrote that the basic chronological classification of pre-classic, classic, and post-classic was such a biased and useless view that we had to get rid of, even if we just go, early, middle, late, or 1, 2, 3. And I was I was ignored. And that would be, something like that. And I've written like post-classic is an implication that this is, not as good as the classic, let alone the implication of the word. And one could go on. I mean, we heard earlier, of the persistence of band, tribe, chiefdom, state, and so on, where we're looking at degrees of, one might say of complexity or so on. So I think you're right on target, but that's a tough call that you're making.
It's really hard because it's the language in which you do business. And to reframe that. I mean, I put this to Don Grayson at one point. So you're telling me all the ways in which the categories and terms in which you work are, the evidence has built up in such a way is now showing that the chronologies and the cultural classifications are untenable. So isn't it time to completely rethink that? And he said, oh, that's for the youngins to do. I can't do that, right? But it is incredibly hard. I think that's where the really creative insights are going to come. Yeah.
I have always thought of public engagement with descendant communities and the creation of, encouragement of the democratization of knowledge as meta-theoretical. It relates to what I think everyone's saying, certainly, Allison, your discussion of standpoint. Imagine that research conversations are taking place in the course of research design with the various descendant communities with which we work around the world. Imagine that they bring in the talents and the perspectives of the knowledge that they have, some of which is superior on the subject of themselves. That certainly it's a framework within which to be tested, in which data, ideas, theory are testable because the people being studied are in a position to challenge ideas that otherwise would just go back to the silo. It's the way to break out of the silo of, it's partly whiteness. It is reproducing itself. And the only way to get out of that silo, and it's all about power, the only way to get out of that is to concede to the others voice, power, discussion, rights, intelligence. And who knows what would come of that? Many different standpoints. At this point, there's too little accountability to anything other than what I'm calling the gated intellectual community that likes to talk and listen to itself and occasionally pats itself on the back for how critical it had been. But the other is not allowed into the room, like the child in the tale of the emperor's new clothes. So if we want real progress, there needs to be a meta-theoretical, this is one meta-theoretical way of getting beyond and over the self that's being reproduced here. On the other hand, just finally, maybe that self is what is a function of archaeology and anthropology. It's certainly been the function of anthropology in general. To produce a world, where all the people of color are in the Natural History Museum and the white people are in the History Museum. To produce a world that is conveniently conceived for the status quo of the power relations that exist. So with anthropology, so it's about whether you want the society to change too, or not. But you can't change it by yourself. When Martin Wobst, right, used to say, you can't jump your own shadow. And I think that's about right.
We're over time, like I said, but I think I'd be remiss if we didn't take at least a few questions from the audience. The graduate students have been scribbling furiously, so I assume there's at least some questions out there. Yes, you, Kara. So I think we have mics set up. Are the mics up there turned on? But if there are any questions, raise your hand and feel free to ask. Or are people too hungry? Yeah, oh, Kara. You can talk, I know you can talk loud.
I'm very loud. So my question relates to earlier conversations, Patricia, that you brought up about the community. And I think this was touched on, especially discussions on neutrality and who the community is. And that essentially is my question, is who are we as archaeologists defining as the community? Who are the stakeholders, especially when we as archaeologists work in regions that might be contested on who owns that land, who operates that land, not even descendant communities, but who has the right to have a stake in that land's history. How do we navigate that kind of stickiness, or do we need to embrace it?
You need to embrace it, sorry. I mean, a great example of this is the work that Ruth Van Dyke is doing around Chaco Canyon. And she started having conversations with Dene people about their links to Chaco Canyon. And then all of a sudden, the Puebloan peoples who obviously, track their ancestry back that way also were like kind of looking askance at her and saying, are you taking their side? Are you telling me you're taking seriously their claims that they might have been around when Chaco Canyon was built? And she's like, I'm interviewing them. I'm just listening to them. I mean, this is her, like, the book that won an award and everything. So it is really messy. It can get very confusing. And, of course, there's a whole literature out there on what is community, how do we carve out this sort of and bound this group of people that we're going to interact with in order to perform some, archaeological survey or excavation program. And so those are tough questions, and they're really can become very sticky issues. And I don't deny that for 1 minute. In some cases it's very clear cut. In other cases, like Michael was mentioning, how do you define a descendant community when you're talking about people, a burial community, people who have been dead for centuries. So I think that those things still are like kind of just case by case basis, and you have to kind of just keep in the front of your mind that you're trying to do no harm, and you're trying to do something that is beneficial to everyone, and kind of let those more those larger ethical issues guide you through it. But sometimes it just doesn't work out, or sometimes, like, you have to pull a David Hurst Thomas at the end and say, God, I really screwed that one up. Let me press the restart button here, and I'll go over this one again in a different place altogether. I've had to do that.
Other questions? Anyone else? Everybody's hungry. Okay, we can end the session now. I think, Rob, did you have any announcements? I saw, was there a hand? Hand? Ask your question.
I wanted to build on Kara's panel, but maybe raise the stakes to when the stakeholders have power and want you to use archaeology in a way that you're not comfortable with. So I'm thinking, give it away. I work in Mediterranean, and sometimes when the classical world archaeology is used to advance fascist nationalist causes that I don't like. And so how do you deal with that? 'Cause it kind of inverts the power relationship sometimes, especially when the state is what you're dealing with rather than sort of a local civic community that's disemboweled.
Did you want me to handle that?
That was it. People wanted to ask.
Well, last spring, I was at a conference in Santiago de Compostela with Alfredo Gonzalez Ribal, and he was so concerned about populism in archaeology, and really felt that archaeologists who did community archaeology were kind of, what's the term he was using? Epistemic populism, I think he
Also,
uses
like,
it. And
misguided
yeah.
namby-pamby liberals who had no politics. And the soft and the hard language was quite interesting. Because it was women who had the soft politics and no serious hard politics. I'm like, really? You're going to put that in print? He did.
Not a fan of
Not a
Alfredo,
fan.
apparently.
Yeah.
But then I started to, then they started taking us around and showing us, this is, a kind of a neo-Franco kind of bastion here and there. And, so, I think that when you are really confronting that in a way that we're just starting to kind of think about that in this country in terms of the populism and how that, in this country, I don't think archaeology is going to factor into it, but the Mediterranean, certainly it does in the Mediterranean area. And those are also really tough issues and difficult issues. And that's a place where it's really almost hard for archaeologists who work in the US or work in the Americas even, where that dynamic does not come into play. How are you going to situate yourself in your research in the Mediterranean so that you're not feeding into this kind of really virulent populism that is very much in the rise in the Mediterranean? And so I see that as a real issue for people working in that part of the world. And so I guess I'm not quite. I'm a little bit more of a fan of Alfredo than
There are some things I'm a fan of. I mean, the things he says about, let's think about the metaphors of uncovering and recovering and what we can actually, what archaeologists can actually show tangibly that calls into question as definitively as it gets some of the histories that are constructed to legitimate reactionary politics. And I think that's absolutely right. But to then take the stand that, you, as he says, as an archaeologist, you need to tell the people what actually is the truth and that they're wrong. Like, really? Maybe you would want to understand how they got to the place where they are. I mean, there's a thing about understanding the politics of the communities you're engaging with, right? And there's divisions and range of views in those communities. He was particularly critical, I'm just embarrassed that I'm forgetting her name, an Irish archaeologist who has a wonderful paper in the Global Archaeology special issue of World Archaeology, that she had just soft politics and was, doing I don't know, anyway, no, it wasn't, and I'm so embarrassed I can't remember, but she has a rebuttal to him. And she's Irish, she's a stakeholder. And she says her purpose working in Ireland is not to take sides one against the other, but to try to draw people on all sides to an understanding of a history of the Troubles and antecedent to the Troubles, which shows how much more deeply entangled their communities are with one another. How much more complex the history is than what gets told in ways that cement or reinforce or actually exacerbate polarization under contemporary political economic conditions. She says she's on the side of peacemaking. And I thought that, or finding ways forward within community, I thought that was a quite compelling, it may not work in all contexts, it has to be case by case, but that was a much more compelling response than you need to take a side and stake a claim that as an expert, you can sort it out for these people, right? So I think that, yeah. I get these, whenever I talk about collaborative practice in the UK or Europe, I get these questions. How can you possibly expect us to talk to these people and take them seriously? It's like, well, yeah, you may need, there's different kinds of taking seriously, but yeah, you do need to understand who you're working with or trying to mediate with or trying to engage.
It's great to have that interlocutor role. The whole, sometimes I say, think that the process is product. Just the conversations that are possible, and in the context of a cemetery or an archaeological site may help. But you remind me of of conversations we had on the panel Disorders of Industrial Society that was led by Skip Roy Rappaport here at Michigan, a Wintergren Foundation, a Michigan published book called Disorders of Industrial Society. And we have a white paper from the 90s on mostly cultural anthropologists on public engagement. And this was the kind of question: do we work for Nazis? And I think the simple, one would not be comfortable in doing that. I think part of the simple answer is that the AAA ethics do not require us to work. We're not required to do research at all. And when the question comes about of doing harm, we may choose not to conduct research at all. And then finally, you remind me of some, there were issues that came up in New York at one point. There were some community members who wanted us to say that slavery did not exist in Africa. Now, I understand that problem because it's often, I've heard it, laid on the Africans when it actually was a European-generated institution and economy, but, kind of blamed on the Africans. And I think, well, we said, we understand, not that they weren't involved, some were involved, certainly, in that economy. The Dahomians are the worst. But, well, the English and the Portuguese were the worst. And so we understand, and we're going to address this issue with care. We'll have Joseph Indekori, who will talk about different forms of servitude, difference in chattel slavery, and so forth. But it's our understanding that slavery did exist in Africa. Now, this could have been a deal breaker, because our job is to tell the truth based on we will address their questions and ours that they accept, but the results are ours. And so if the empirical, so we said, but we understand that there was slavery in Africa. And they could have decided to do the thing most people do: get a religious practitioner to memorialize their ancestors' remains. And we go away and they do what people do. And that's all right. But maybe that conversation was good because it allowed them to, not only did it allow them to, the descendant community, the African-American community in New York, to trust us, and there were many factors involved in that. The fact that African-Americans were in the leadership as well of this multiracial project of 30 PhDs. But 2 years later, well into the project, the Ghanaians sent a delegation to New York and to our laboratory. It was the two houses of chiefs, basically the royal houses, had challenged corrupt African leaders of today, citing the enslavement of people in the past. And so they came under the Adinkra banner of reuniting the house, right? Coming to the US to reunite the house. It's called Fahankra, it's an Adinkra symbol, based on this acknowledgement that slavery existed in Africa and that people have to take responsibility. And we were able to meet them, right, with the same honesty. So, and then finally, I want to say, with regard to identifying descendant communities, I'm always remembered of Jane Dykstra, who came out of the meetings a year before among the physical anthropologists, the year before Native Americans completely circumvented the anthropologists and went to Congress and got NAGPRA. When she comes out of the meeting with the physical anthropologist, and there's a debriefing luncheon, I'm there, and she says, well, you know, there are those political Indians. We don't really need to deal with them. We want the, you know, the good, the rational ones. And of course, they're the ones who agree with her that Native people should have no control of their remains. I saw that as an African American as the kind of ploy, and we also saw at James Madison's Montpelier, of selecting other people's leaders. It's not our business to determine who the descendant community leaders are. That's up to them. And if they have to squabble about it, that's their fight. We should make this, what we do is make the space to allow them to come together, to encourage them to come together and select their own leadership. If it's not their own selected leadership, it's not their leadership. It's your leadership selected for them. And that's in the American struggle around race and many other things, I imagine. So that's messy, because you have to stand back. It doesn't belong to you. And for the occupiers, descendants, to understand that everything does not belong to you. You know, and I think also of the Christian elected, who are convinced that everything belonged to them. This is something that has to be gotten over in order to allow real, multiple voices, equally empowered, to move knowledge forward. It's their business. Our business is to listen.
Well, on that note, I think we should call it a night. And can we have a round of applause for our panelists? Rob, did you need to make any announcements?
No, just that the first session tomorrow will be at 9:30 a.m. If participants in the morning session can be here about 10 to 15 minutes beforehand so we can get everyone mic'd up.
Thank you.
Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, you know, she was working with them. No, she got it.
Yeah, so sorry for the space.